Thank you.
Can I stop you really quick?
Yes.
I forgot to read their bios, and I would like to make sure everyone's in the right spot. So, George Leakey's involvement in the Civil Rights Movement led to the training staff of the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer and co-writing a manual for direct action. He's given leadership to a variety of campaigns and led over 1,500 workshops on 5 continents. While teaching at Swarthmore College, he built a database of 1,000 campaigns in almost 200 countries. His books, Viking Economics and How We Win, are published by Melville House. Mark Bray is a political organizer and historian of human rights, terrorism, and politics in modern Europe. He's the author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, also the author of Translating Anarchy, The Anarchism of Occupy Wall Street, and the co-editor of Anarchist Education in the Modern School, Francisco Ferreira Reader. His work has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Washington Post, Salon, and numerous edited volumes. He's currently a lecturer at Dartmouth College.
Okay, well, again, hello. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Molly, for agreeing to moderate. Thank you, George, for the invitation to participate in this conversation. I want to start out by saying I have a profound respect for George and his work. There have been conversations around these issues that have happened in public forums in the past that I think have had a real lack of good faith, and we want to do otherwise. And we're calling this a dialogue because there's a role for arguing politics. We should always argue politics, strategy, and tactics. We're going to do that today. But I hope that we can also think about how we can coexist, recognizing that we're never going to all agree about some important questions, and work together, recognizing that we're on the same side of the struggle against fascism. So those are a few thoughts that I hope will give a sense of where I'm trying to come from. A few other preliminary remarks. In my opinion, there is no one-size-fits-all mode of politics or fighting fascism, let alone anything else. All forms of politics should, at least to some extent, be contextual, should assess the situation at hand, and respond accordingly. There's an important role to be played in understanding history. I am a historian, I'm really into that. But also, contexts geographically, culturally, and historically can be different. What worked 50 years ago may not work 50 years from now, and so forth and so on. Also, it's rare in any historical moment for there to be only one form of struggle. There are usually multiple forms of struggle, multiple different strategic perspectives that play out at the same time, sometimes even within the same organization, that overlap each other. And so, as a historian and not a political scientist, I'm skeptical of claims that isolate one variable to explain causal phenomena in history and politics. It's really hard to do, it's usually wrong, and so therefore I think you can make arguments for what works, but situate those arguments within broader contexts where it's never just that one thing. I'm not going to give a fully formed, well-rounded pitch on how to fight fascism and white supremacy, because I don't think such a pitch exists. But I am going to make some comments about certain basic orientations that I think that we should adopt, and I'm going to give a pitch for certain insights from the militant anti-fascist movement, because I wrote a book about it. Now, probably most folks here are somewhat familiar, but I just want to reiterate what that is. The militant anti-fascist tradition goes back a century, and in a broader sense goes back as far as resistance to white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism. But as a sort of crystallized, distinct tendency, I think really emerged after World War II. And without getting too far into the history, a lot of it has to do with a rejection of the possibility that the state can be counted upon to stop fascism. Rejection of the police and the courts as arbiters of that conflict. There's a lot to be said about the militant anti-fascist tradition. Most of what anti-fascists do today, have done in the past, does not entail conflict, but some of it does. So I'm going to shift gears towards the things that I think we disagree about. That's probably why most people are here. In my opinion, if you want to start talking about resistance to white supremacy, resistance to fascism, you can never lose sight of the most egregious manifestations of what these things have meant in the present and the past. On a personal level, Jewish members of my mother's family were murdered by the Nazis in eastern Poland and Ukraine in the 1940s. For me, that's a point of reference in thinking about anti-fascism, and in that sense, self-defense against such forces is lamentably sometimes necessary. How often it's necessary, I think, is debatable. The fact that it is sometimes necessary to me is not actually debatable. I refuse the notion that it was somehow unjust or unstrategic for Jews in Eastern Europe to fight back when they were being slaughtered by the Nazis. Now, I'm not saying that that situation is necessarily representative of all situations, and in that sense, I'm not making an argument about what people should do in all times and places. I'm saying that self-defense in the struggle against fascism and white supremacy is necessarily one of the options in the toolbox. It always has to be one of the options in the toolbox. If you argue for taking it out of the toolbox, you disarm the left, you disarm people who are under attack against fascism when the time comes. If you look at the debates in Germany in the 1920s leading up to the rise of Hitler, there were top-level leaders in the left parties who argued against mobilizing a militant response against the Nazis. I think that was a mistake, which is not to say that if they had done otherwise, things necessarily would have worked out, but I think that was a mistake. For nonviolent resistance to work, and I do think that in most political circumstances, nonviolent resistance is the way to go. For nonviolent resistance to work, it needs to leverage some sector of public opinion. It is a politics of public opinion. Therefore, the question is, looking back again to the 1940s, was there a sector of public opinion that could have been leveraged to stop the Nazi death machine? I don't think so. Let's talk a little bit more about violence. We need to talk about state violence when we talk about this issue. I'm very curious to hear George's take on this, and this I think maybe is the one takeaway point from my first 10 minutes is I actually don't believe that there is a nonviolent way to fight fascism. I believe there is that which trusts the violence of the state to stop fascism, and there is that which does not. And every strategic option either relies on the violence of the state to stop fascism or the violence of anti-fascists and those under attack to defend themselves. What do I mean by that? Fascism is necessarily violent and aggressive. If you find a form of politics that is not violent and aggressive, it is not fascism. Fascism targets a wide variety of different communities and populations, violently, necessarily. Fascists will exterminate those populations over time if they are not met with some sort of countervailing force. Those who argue that there's a nonviolent way to stop them explicitly or implicitly rely on the police to do it. That's why I don't think that there actually is a nonviolent way to stop fascism. Discussion about the role of the media and the societal narrative in resistance is important. I am making an argument for the importance of mass politics in stopping fascism. I don't think that the militant anti-fascist tradition is the only tradition or can always necessarily by itself do the job. We need a broader societal resistance. But that doesn't mean that we always need to select forms of resistance that are the most popular. The kind of irony with some of these conversations is that there's an assumption that nonviolent tactics are always very popular. I would argue that most forms of nonviolent resistance, if you were to do a poll of society, are actually fairly unpopular, and that also bears out historically. The lunch counter sit-ins had very low favorability ratings among the general public, for example. Now that doesn't mean that you don't cater tactics and strategies in a way that aims to build support. Of course you do. But that doesn't mean that you think of the society as sort of like a broad, nebulous population. I think it's more useful to think of multiple publics, multiple communities that respond differently to different kinds of politics, different kinds of tactics and strategies. And so when it comes to resisting fascism, it's important to think also of the perspective of those victims of fascism that often do not have popular support in society. The people who, if they are quote-unquote cleansed, as the Nazis would like to, will not have anyone cry out on their behalf. And so, you know, if you think about, for example, Roma populations under attack in Greece. Greek society doesn't really care for the most part. So it raises interesting questions about what nonviolence can do, and even more fundamentally about what solidarity means with people we disagree with. It's one thing to make an argument about certain forms of struggle, but it's another to say, what do you do when there are people who are resisting differently? The phrase diversity of tactics has been used and abused in a variety of ways. In its best form, the intention of the phrase is to try and come up with a way for different movements to struggle. And so for me, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to wrap up. Maybe the most important question is, how do we respond when people fight back differently? Because the condemnation of self-defense against fascism plays into the hands of the state. And finally, there's an equivalent critique that's been made by centrist Democrats even against militant nonviolent folks. If you think about, for example, people who disrupted the Kavanaugh stuff, that they are part of the mob. There's always another layer of someone who's farther and farther to the center to say that you are the mob and you should be met with state repression. Plenty more to be said. Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Mark, for participating in this dialogue. I've been really excited about it. That's why I asked you to do it, because I was so impressed by the book. Because to me, the book lifts the whole question onto the strategic realm, where we can really talk back and forth about pros and cons. We can talk about historical situations and this situation in the light of strategic concepts rather than just from the gut. And while I don't discount the gut, I have a gut too. I think it's very exciting when people talk about political issues in a strategic way. So I also will, like you, not talk globally, try to cover everything in terms of abstract global statements, but try to address the situation that we're in now. And specifically, that's my first point, an analytic point, which is this political moment, as I see it. As I see it, it's a highly polarized situation. And I've asked everybody everywhere I go, and everybody agrees with me, that we've got a tremendous degree of polarization, and that actually, as far as I can tell, is the biggest, we're moving at least toward the biggest point of polarization that we've experienced in our society in my lifetime. I'm 81 years old, and I think it goes back at least that far before we can find a similar degree of polarization, and it's being engineered by, unwittingly perhaps, by the economic elite. Because the economic elite is very, very interested in policies that make us increasingly unequal. And economic inequality has been found by political scientists to coincide with polarization. So the more inequality you get in a society, the more it becomes polarized, and with the consequent results of shouting and violence and the whole works that goes with it, as we're seeing now, but I fully expect us to see lots more, because things are set up so that economic inequality will increase. So but you can tell from what I've already said that I consider the real enemy of progressive causes to be the economic elite, because it is who is A, in charge, and B, generating this polarization that makes life so difficult, and in that sense, also generating the rise of fascism and white supremacy and the rest, and anti-Semitism and so on, because that goes along with polarization. In other words, I think that there are always haters. I've worked around the world, I have yet to find a society where there aren't haters. The question is, how much of a political problem are they? And in many times and places, they're not a political problem. So the question gets to be, when do they become a political problem? Under what social circumstances do they increase in numbers and in boldness in such a way as to make it difficult for progressives to move forward? And the levers that increase or decrease the amount of fascism in a society are the levers that are being manipulated by the economic elite because of the consequence, whether witting or not, of polarization. And so I'm very interested in going after the perpetrators of our situation rather than the symptom of the situation. I would say I would love to see everybody's energy focused on getting the economic elite out of its dominant position, and this has actually been accomplished in some societies, rather than focusing on the often working class. I'm blue-collar background, I recognize some of those folks. Usually working class people who are recruited by fascists and act out in ways that we, I think almost everyone dislikes. So I'm much more interested in going after the cause of our present situation and the increase of fascism rather than in the effect in the result of that. Now, I think that there's a lot of wisdom to be gained in dealing with white supremacists and fascists from the civil rights movement. Now, that may be partly a bias because of my first 2 semesters in the civil rights movement. That's where I cut my teeth, so to speak, with regard to the struggle. But I don't know another movement which has gotten so much done against so much opposition. Think of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organizers going into Mississippi in 1963. Klan territory. Who do you go to for protection? The Klan wants you dead. Local law enforcement? Hey, those are folks putting on sheets at night and going out, right? And burning crosses. Don't even bother. The state, maybe the state of Mississippi? The state of Mississippi wants you dead. Well, maybe the federal government. But President John F. Kennedy will not touch you with a 10-foot pole, nor with his brother Robert Kennedy, head of the Justice Department. The feds are missing in action. Even worse than missing in action, the feds include J. Edgar Hoover, head of FBI, who is trying to do you in, actively trying to do you in. All right, so what you have is young people, the age of some of you here, who are in a situation, I can't imagine a situation in U.S. history more unprotected for organizers trying to change the system, and not only just trying to tweak the system in Mississippi, they are trying to actually do in legalized segregation. Obviously impossible, given that array that I've just described, right? And so I think we better find out, if we're interested in combating fascism, how did they pull that off? Because they did not pull it off by getting protection from people who were fighting fascists in order to protect them. They didn't even pull it off by getting protection from people who were using violence. They pulled it off through a nonviolent struggle. If they could pull that off, this would be my contention, then we can pull off anything that we're facing in this situation, because we ain't facing anything like those folks did at that time. In my new book, How We Win, I do try to distill the lessons from that period, and including especially, for me, the Mississippi period, for us today, if we feel in situations where we're lacking protection, where we're really out there, on a big limb. I draw lessons from SNCC about that. They went through it. Let's learn from them. Finally, a problem that I have strategically with regard to emphasizing fascism in the way that anti-fag works very often is the stimulation of fear. I think it very much is relying on on how scared we are and mobilizing that fear in order to be able to carry out the actions that it carries out. I find that problematic because I think we're already scared. And I don't find fearful people to be the most reliable comrades for me when I'm in the struggle. In the civil rights movement, we did not stimulate fear. We didn't even encourage fear. We acknowledged it because it's real, and people shook. I shook. But when I was being beaten up, I certainly did. And the thing is, though, that the spirit of the movement was not about, look how scared they are, look how many guns they've got, look, last night they were out burning, doing bonfires again, or blowing up that church over there. The focus was very different from the mobilization of fear, because it's very hard to get a mass movement strong enough to really win your goal. Which the goal is not just about getting some working class people to stop acting out. The goal, right, is change. We want equality. We want justice. That's the goal. And you can't get the masses of people that you need to accomplish that goal based on scaring people, in my view. So I think, especially at this political moment, that becomes problematic. What I love in the Montgomery situation, Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, was when the Ku Klux Klan decided, oh, well, we're used to intimidating. We'll intimidate the black community by a motorcade, you know, with our sheets on, through the black community and scare them out of continuing their boycott. What people did was came out on their stoops, came out on their porches with lemonade, with the kids, and sat around and looked at these weird people coming down the car. Oh, that's not a bad car. That car. And look at those weird people. Something like that. Acted as if it was some kind of harmless, funny parade that was going through their neighborhood. Guess how long that motorcade went on? 4 blocks, and they turned and went off. Because intimidation is their thing. And if we don't allow ourselves to be intimidated, if we don't stimulate each other's fear, but instead engage in the kind of action that black people in Montgomery did in order to defeat the Ku Klux Klan, then we have a chance to get rid of such an awesome thing as legalized segregation. We can go for some very, very big goals. But if we allow ourselves to be immobilized by fear, then I think we're cooked, because we won't be able to get the big enough goals. Yeah.
All right, now we have a 10-minute response from Mark, and then 10 more from you.
Great, thank you. So I wish it were true that you couldn't mobilize masses through fear, but the fact of fascism unfortunately begs to differ on that. Though I would disagree with the characterization of anti-fascism as being about stoking fear. I think there's a difference between stoking fear and pointing out a problem and organizing with people who are already afraid. Some of that maybe is semantics as far as what we mean by fear. But anyway, I'm not going to get bogged down in that. The question of what the real problem is and how explicitly fascist and white supremacist groups relate to that problem is interesting. So I've done a lot of presentations around this topic, and I have had the argument put, the real enemy, quote unquote, is the Trump administration. The real enemy is the corporate state. If you go by Chris Hedges' perspective, the real enemy is bigger issues. I don't think that we have to choose just one enemy. There's a lot of enemies, unfortunately. If there's only one, maybe we get to wrap this up quicker. But I do think it's important to realize a couple of things. One is that these fascist groups and their supporters are trivial until they're not. Right, so the whole notion with, especially post-war militant anti-fascism, is you treat small fascist groups as if they could be the seeds of big fascist groups. They look back to the fact that, you know, Hitler, his first meeting with the German Workers' Party before the name changed to the Nazi Party, there were 54 people in attendance. Mussolini started with about 100 fascists before it grew. So the thought experiment is, what if the European left treated those small groups? Of course, at the time, they had no reason to be concerned about these small groups. But in hindsight, if they had treated Mussolini's 100 with the seriousness of Mussolini's regime, how might things be different? And that's a counterfactual, because in the post-war period, militant anti-fascists have taken up this idea. It's the no platform for fascism. You don't give fascism even one step forward. How many large fascist movements have been stopped by doing this? We'll never know, and that's a very good thing. So you want to treat them seriously while they're not, quote-unquote, serious. But they are serious. People are getting killed. Actual people are getting killed. So, you know, with all due respect, the phrase acting out, I would take issue with that phrase. They are killing people. They are killing people. And they're not killing just random people, usually. They're killing specific people who have reason to be scared, who have reason to consider self-defense classes, reason to consider buying weapons. And if they kill one person, that's serious. I'm not saying that you're saying otherwise, but I'm just making a point about what I consider to be serious. So they are certainly a symptom, but they're also a cause. We can see if we look back to interwar Europe that there was this dominant perspective in the European left that the real goal was the revolution, and everything that, like, oh, don't pay attention to these fascist groups, pay attention to the capitalist elite. Sure, let's pay attention to the capitalist elite. Sure, let's expropriate them. But we can recognize that sometimes it plays out that when you're on the way to expropriating them, there's a reaction. Because what we've seen, and not just in the history of fascism, but in the history of revolution, that regardless of how we struggle, if we get close to taking away their stuff, they're going to drown us in blood. They are. Whether paramilitaries in Colombia, whether fascists, whether you name it. How to respond to that? I don't know. But we need to be ready for it. And that's part of what the history of fascism is about, is that these things are not distinct, that working class self-defense needs to be a consideration of working class expropriation of the ruling class. The civil rights example that George cites is very inspirational. That's awesome. I will say, and this may sound like nitpicking, but it relates to a larger point, that sure, local authorities were not to be counted upon. Sure, federal authorities were not to be counted upon. But there were limits to that. If the Klan started full-scale assaults on black communities, there would have been efforts at self-defense. If those efforts failed and entire communities were being wiped out, there would have been a response by the state, because they couldn't have that massive, explicit, violent response, even in the early 60s. There were limits. And those limits existed in one form or another through the violence of the state. And there were prosecutions in the 60s, of course, often there weren't, but there was just enough of a threat of state violence in various forms to stop a wholesale race war from erupting. And the history of black freedom struggles is also a history of black self-defense, as George well knows. And that needs to be part of the story as well. And these histories often overlapped, they often fed off of each other. And the palatability of certain demands among centrist white communities was always influenced by the specter of what if we don't give them something. So again, I think you really need to think of the interrelations between various different forms of responses, and one could hypothetically make an argument that these different factions supported each other, that these nonviolent movements benefit from what if we don't give them something. Because ultimately, if you look at the history of the state when confronted with social revolution, it's been a history of either full-scale eliminating the threat or giving enough for people to just go on with their lives. And then waiting a generation before taking it back, of course. So whenever you win a significant demand vis-a-vis the state, there's always a calculus of the state realizing that this actually, in some form or another, strengthens it. That's always a give and take, which doesn't mean that it's wrong to get these advances, right? These advances are materially important. They often benefit struggles, but you need to be also aware of the underlying logic of why we're given them, and the kinds of violences that it empowers when they are given. And that by giving something, those who want more are demonized. There's always that back and forth. And if we want to think about what it really means to build a post-capitalist society, and the lengths that rich people will go to stop that from happening, we need to take seriously state violence and how we're going to deal with it. And public opinion in relation to that struggle will shift over time. And that's the other thing, is that public opinion exists. We should take it into account for building mass movements, but also recognize that we are the public and we have the ability to shape narratives. Recently, if you look at, for example, the social movements of the last decade, when Occupy started, at least on the East Coast, the notion of having a march that blocked traffic was like, whoa, what's going on? But after Ferguson, after Baltimore, a march in the street in New York City was just another thing. It shifts the center of gravity for what is understandable when you have tactical escalation. How am I doing on time? 2 minutes? All right, say a few more things that I meant to say in the beginning and I forgot, so please excuse me. I think there's a lot of ground upon which our various movements and perspectives can coexist in organizing against the far right. I think there's a few principles, and George, if you wouldn't mind, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on them, that I hope that we can sort of all get behind in one form or another. One is no platform for fascism. No platform for fascism. How we stop that platform, there's so many ways to stop fascists from having a platform. If you don't like one way, do another way.
Let's stop fascists from having a platform. Reject the notion that we can have a meaningful conversation with people who want to dehumanize us. And the second thing is we go where they go, as Anti-Racist Action said, that we should always counter-protest. We should always have an oppositional voice. We may disagree with what that protest looks like. We're always going to disagree about what that protest looks like, but let's have an oppositional voice. The notion that we can just ignore them and they'll go away is just not based on anything. And we always need to make clear that when fascists try to normalize themselves in society, we need to show that to be the crisis that it is. Because the way to stop fascist organizing is to stop the various things that go into organizing, whether you're on the left or the right, embedding yourself in communities, propagating your ideas, normalizing yourself in society. That needs to be stopped. It can be stopped in so many different ways. If you don't like the way that self-described Antifa groups do it a different way. Do it. I'm going to leave it at that, even though I have a minute left.
This is so enjoyable. Thank you. Thank you. So it's great. I'll respond right away to the principles because that is a subject to me. Actually, I like fascists to have a platform because I love to argue with fascists. And not only that, not just because of personal love for taking people on, but also I would love everybody to be empowered to do that. That is to say, if it were possible for them not to have a platform, then there are a whole lot of people who don't get a political education, who are not empowered to be able to take that on in their families or in their, off in the corners. So I like public debates and public contestation with all kinds of opinions, not only fascist opinions, because I like the empowerment, I like the public education, which I think anesthetizes people against fascism when they hear much more sensible ideas than fascism being expressed. So I welcome it and would love it. Another thing, with regard to going where they're going, or going after them, just a few weeks ago we had in Philadelphia this experience of, via social media, it looked as though the Proud Boys were coming to Philadelphia. So great excitement in social media land. Oh, we better get down there, we better do this. So as it ended up, it wasn't the Proud Boys, it was another group, but it was a group of conservatives. They called themselves conservatives anyway. And it was a group of maybe 40 people or something like that. And in Philadelphia, it's a big city. 40 people do not get mass media attention, right? However, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who were against them turned out. Guess what? 26 column inches of the Philadelphia Inquirer. 6 photographs, 2 of them in color. The amount of attention. I wish I could get 40 people together and get that amount of attention for my cause that the conservatives got. How handy. Plus, think of the reactivity there. Think of the reactivity. It's like they can scam us, right? It's like they can pull our chain. Oh, we're going to show up here. That'll get everybody out. We'll show up here. That'll get everybody out. I feel manipulated by that stuff. I feel manipulated by the other side when they can count on me responding. It's not even responding. It's reacting. Now, again, back to the political moment that I was referring to earlier. Maybe in another decade, because I agree with you, global is not the way to go. We have to be situational. There might be another time when that is not our problem as a progressive, community in the United States. That we're not reactive, that we tend to be very proactive, and we're organizing nonviolent direct action campaigns, and we're moving forward, and we have that sense of momentum, and then occasionally, react to some fascists coming to town. That might be okay. But my analysis of what's going on in our country now is that we're in a very reactive kind of mode. That people tend to be out in the street doing this, in response to a tweet, or in response to acts taken by the other side. And I don't like reactivity, to tell you the truth, because I don't think it accomplishes real change. I think it's people running around, expending our energy, in ways that don't actually advance our goals. It's the reason why I wrote How We Win is because the evidence that I read is that how we win is through sustained campaigns that are persistently pursued and escalated to the point that we can force opponents to give way in ways that they don't want to. It takes that kind of persistence, which means proactive, which means we have to know what we want and pursue it. And if we're forever doing these little side trips in order to deal with 40 people or whatever, I hate to think that we're using our energy that way. Finally, do I have another minute? 5 more minutes. Yay, yay, yay. Okay, so the previous book to this one was called Viking Economics. It required a lot of research into how Sweden, Norway, Denmark managed to turn themselves around from a mess a century ago, high inequality, high degree of injustice, to the societies that are now on the top of anybody's, not anybody's, but on the top of internationally agreed upon economic criteria for well-being, for justice, that kind of thing. Best place in the world to be a mom, to be an elder, to be a youngster, on and on and on and on. The criteria are up there. They had this enormous turnaround. They didn't manage utopia. Disappointment. Okay, they did not get to utopia. But compared with here, they look pretty good. I mean, I wish we would turn ourselves around to that degree so that we could deliver at least as much as they delivered. And I think it's no accident Americans are emigrating to Norway as we speak. So what enabled them to make that turnaround? They made that turnaround, in a position of enormous polarization, the biggest experience of polarization they've had in modern times. So they weren't stuck by polarization, but they used the volatility of society to wage nonviolent direct action campaigns. Industrial workers did strikes, others did other things. They did campaigns that moved them forward, and by getting a movement of movements together, were able to push their economic elite out of the way, out of its historic dominance, and open the political space to create, for the first time in history, an economic model that delivered something approximating justice. For the first time. Now, there were Nazis marching in the streets of Oslo while this was going on, and in the streets of Stockholm in Sweden. There was, in other words, along with the polarization, just as I said earlier, you get a lot of polarization, you're going to have fascists showing up. They had that showing up in that society, and they were trying to stimulate violence in the streets with the left, as happened in Germany, of course, quite successfully, right? You find out where leftists are hanging out in the tavern down there, you go down there, and you pick a fight, and you get a big fight. And that kind of thing was going on and on and on in Germany, with increasing amount of physical violence playing out in Germany. And in Italy, the same thing happened. The Scandinavians wouldn't take the bait. That's how I see it. I see it as the fascists offering bait out here. Hey, we'll dangle ourselves. You come over here and fight us. Aha, that's great from our point of view, right? Okay, so that over and over and over in Germany and Italy, we know where that went. We know that the middle classes decided, well, we'll go for law and order, you know, and support, or at least not dissent from, the economic elite's choice to give the state to Hitler in Germany's case and to Mussolini in Italy's case, because middle-class people, by and large, can't tolerate so much disorder. Right? But in Scandinavia, they didn't take the debate. They didn't take the debate. And therefore, there wasn't this rising degree of violence going on in the situation. And so bids for a coup couldn't work out. And they were successful in overthrowing their economic elite. That's what I want in my country. 2 minutes left. I can't believe it. Wow. Okay, so now, so what we've learned, though, from our experience here in this country, is that it helps enormously to have nonviolence training in order to prepare for the fracases that do break out. Because I agree with Mark. Violence shows up, people are killed. Squirrel Hill in my state not long ago. We can expect more and more of that. We can expect things to become more dangerous, and therefore people to be more and more freaked out. And the solution that some Jewish congregations that I know are taking with that is to invoke something new on the horizon that didn't exist in the Europe of the 30s. And that is the systematic training of people in nonviolent struggle so that they can take on the threat that is coming from the right in order to be able to increase people's well-being and sense of security. Will it take care of people, quote unquote? I mean, will it mean that we'll all feel safe? No, not if we're in touch with reality. But on the other hand, it will increase our chances of safety and drop the level of violence. I think that's the way to go. To understand, in other words, that the lessons to be taught by movements in tough places like the Civil Rights Movement, and there are others from other countries that had to confront major violence, including violence from the state. If we learn those lessons, then I think we can take on the fascists in the times when we need to take them on, not just reactively, but we can take on the fascists and win and overthrow the economic elite that wants to run our lives forever.
All right. Thank you, George. Thank you, Mark. Let's take a couple minutes for people just to gather your thoughts for the Q&A. So people can turn to a person next to you and chat for a few minutes or write down your question if you need some quiet reflection. That was a lot. It was fabulous. And let's just take a second and process it before we get into the Q&A. So we'll just take 4 or 5 minutes now. The format of the Q&A, just a reminder, is people are going to ask a question either to Mark and George, and then both of them will have a chance to respond.
Everything is terrible.
That's not that good. I mean, not just the rich, it's the I think I would score the state. I think I would score street. I think on the theoretical point, Mark with the state, he supports the passage just starting to put all everywhere, always. It's a strategic question. How do we keep Nazis afraid? But on the practical point, able to defend ourselves against fascism. I'm not sure how he defines the platform. The idea of like, how do you use the both ends and use the platform for us to take excuse to You're asking me? I think it's a question
No question.
I think it's a question of framing.
That's the question.
It's at both ends. We need to demonstrate that we're being non-violent. Then the Nazis attack us. Then we can attack them. Even though we're absolutely
No violence.
It's important because that guy's violent strategy is going to get us squished. For sure. It's going to be the boot, stepping on the face. But two, just get it out of here. You're going to do it anyway. It's really important to shape the narrative. We've tried non-violence. We came after, now we're doing both. don't you wish you could go back to the toilet system? Instead of what Samuel Castro is, oh, we're going to jail the politicians, we're going to destroy their life. Look, why not? You need to fucking, we're not going to make a distinction between the violence guys. They're all going to the camps.
I take it they both
have the capacity to actually
Oh, really? Yeah, well, they call it a dialogue. They're pretty well known figures.
All right, we're going to get started again.
What's your name? Eric. Todd. Nice to meet you, Todd.
All right, so the format of the Q&A is we're going to take a couple questions at once, and then Mark and George are both going to be able to respond to the questions. Let's get I see your hand. Let's do it like you three in the back right there. So you and then you two, and then we'll go on this end or next.
That should be what?
Did everyone hear that, or do we need the mic in the audience? Would it be helpful? Yeah, so the question was, what about the Black Panthers and the Deacons for Defense? That was not about, I forgot the second part. It was not about pacifism. Yeah. Okay.
But as a Finnish American, I also want to highlight that that's where the sons of Odin have come from, that are also influencing U.S. white supremacists, and but there's a rise of fascism in Sweden now. So how does that fit into your portrayal of their tactical
So my question is just to really let us what George. What George said. What has there ever been in recent modern history with democracy, capitalism, any example where the economic elite that you exactly just mentioned would be overthrown without a diversity of tactics? And again, not to promote in any way, shape, or form violence, but just to have that as part of the toolbox when needed for self-defense and resistance. When has that ever happened in modern history? Where the elite has actually been overthrown and true political as well as social and economic transformation has become then the new sort of lay of the land.
Great. So we're going to pause there. Why don't you begin?
Well, a few, they're actually direct questions. Why don't George, you start out, and then I'll say.
And then you respond.
Yeah.
Okay. So the last one first, with regard to, let's see, diversity of tactics. The Scandinavian example is one in which they didn't reach my picture of major revolution, and my radical friends there agree. And on the other hand, as compared with here, those are actual functional democracies in which the majority rule is carried out, and the majority sets the direction for the economy. For example, the majority, even when the political class in Norway decided, let's join the EU, the European Union, the majority said, no, we won't do that. And then they didn't, and they still haven't. So there's a degree of democracy over there that we haven't ever experienced in our country. But it required, in order to get that, they had to push the economic elite out of dominance. And they did choose nonviolent struggle as a way to do that. They had to contest it in the streets. Troops were called out. Surprise, surprise, right? Sweden did a massacre on unarmed workers marching in the streets. So you had class struggle, and the working class won, but in coalition with farmers. That was very important, and also in the context of a vision of what they wanted, which was enormously reassuring to the middle class, because the middle class always wonders when there's a lot of turbulence, is there a place for us? If there is a change, because if there's no place for us, we're on the side of the state. And they hugely reassured the middle class, and in fact recruited the young people of the middle class to join them because they had a vision that would show the common good would be advanced and the economic elite would no longer be running things. So that was done, and that was done without diversity of tactics. I mean, of course, there's always some people doing this and that, but basically the strategy of those movements was nonviolent struggle. Lenin told them that they were wrong. Lenin told the Norwegian Labour Party, you're crazy, you need to prepare for armed struggle. And the Norwegian Labour Party, which was communist-led, said, no thanks. So that's one thing, yeah.
You want to respond to anything else?
Maybe one more with regard to, while we're on Scandinavian and we've got a Finnish American here. Yes, so that's what I mean about fascism. I mean, I think sin will always be with us. And fascism is one form of that. There will always be fascists around. And during economic growth and economic inequality, which has been happening in Sweden more than in the others the last 10, 15 years, then grow the economic inequality, increase the polarization, fascists will come forward. And that's just, it's almost mathematical, it seems. And so the way that they can deal with fascism in Sweden is to return with more commitment to their earlier model, the model that was working better for them, which had to do with, and of course it's the immigration that is the presenting issue, you might say. And I was over there recently and found out that the Swedish government is getting a clue about that, is learning from Norway how to change the way that they handle immigration in such a way as to be able to have less trouble in the future. So, but they learn from each other also. They love to tweak their system in light of each other, and they have the economic elite enough at bay so they have the freedom to actually be empirical, the freedom to actually pay attention to what works.
Thank you for bringing up the question of Scandinavia. I want to do jump back quickly to World War II. The Swedish population didn't, quote-unquote, take the bait with Nazi violence because they collaborated. They let the Nazis march through their country. That's one way around it, right? Because you can't beat them, join them. Yeah. Norway was occupied. The resistance was not super sincere because people in Denmark and people in Norway and Sweden felt a certain racial allegiance to the Third Reich. So it's one thing to look at that as a form of resistance, but you need to take into account the racial dynamics and realize that if you were Roma or Jewish in Poland, you did not have that racial affinity, and you doesn't matter how you respond, you were in the crosshairs. And so part of my bigger argument is we always need to think not from the perspective of those who are most like the fascists, but from those who are suffering the greatest, and how do they need to respond, and how can we support them? And today, part of the reason why you have this significant growth of the far right in Sweden, for example, I would argue, it has to do in part with the incomplete politics of social democracy in essentially still generating wealth from the exploitation of the global south, not having a really sincere internationalist, anti-racist form of socialism, and therefore, of course, when you have a migrant issue, there's xenophobia, there's backlash, and you have a social democracy that becomes social chauvinism. The welfare state, but only for Swedes, the welfare state, but only for Norwegians. And that's the limit of a welfare state without internationalism, and I would argue the limit of social democratic politics. And so there are things to be taken from these examples, but always with those caveats in mind. Yes, of course, Deacons of Defense, Black Panthers, there are a number of other examples that are important to take into this tradition as well. And from my perspective, no, there hasn't been a case of the ruling class been expropriated through purely nonviolent means, and I think that it's impossible.
All right, we got a lot of questions on this side. I see 1 there, 2, and then 3.
So it seems like we're tiptoeing around some language a little bit, because you keep talking about nonviolent, about self-defense, but aren't we really talking about preemptive self-defense, which is offense, about going out on the road, to meet a threat? Because I mean, self-defense is beyond capital, really, I would think. I mean, I would agree with you that there really isn't a debate to be had there. I mean, not least because the law enshrines that right, you know, and you're going to be protected more or less, obviously, if you take self-defense, violent action. But how do you respond? So this question really is more for Mark, I would say. But how do you respond to George's point that there are always going to be haters? I mean, you seem to be speaking sort of from this historical perspective of the dangers of appeasement and accommodation. Obviously, you know, history is rife with examples of those dangers. But how do we know right now that fascism in America is more virulent as opposed to just more visible? That it's a sparking, you know, wire that's gonna catch fire, as opposed to a thing that can be sort of, you know, pushed back into its readouts online, for
example. There's a couple of things. One, I have to take issue with the idea that one way other than the other is inciting fear, because I think we have to acknowledge the fear is here. Nobody is generating fear. We have fear. We have racial murders. We had the 2 Muslim women stabbed on a train in, what was it, Seattle? 2 black men stabbed with a sword in New York City. We have mass shootings like at the Tree of Life. We have Nia Wilson out here and her sister getting stabbed. And I have to say, I'm transgender, my wife's transgender. We don't have a car, we have to walk around. And we have events where these fascists are coming to Berkeley. Came last year, came earlier this year. They don't come anymore. Why? Because militant, confrontational action has chased them out. They don't come anymore. You see their internal locks on places like Unicorn Riot. They say, no, we can't come to Berkeley. Why? Because people will show up and will not let them get away with it. Last time they were having an event, what, 3 people of theirs came? So I have to say that I now feel safer having my wife go out and walk and go shopping on a day they're coming because I know no one's coming. Whereas when they did come in masses before, we had store windows shot out. We've had, like a tattoo parlor had its window broken afterwards. We have reports of them going around and beating people up. We don't have that anymore. So I have to say, the idea of nonviolence. Oh, and the other thing with the making fun of the Klan, yeah, they stopped their march, but did they disband? Or did they go back and come up with other things to do? That didn't solve the problem of the Klan. That just, you know, it didn't end them. It just ended this one action of theirs. So I have to say, to me, the idea of nonviolence says we will sacrifice the most marginalized. We will let them be killed. We will let them die. We will let them be murdered until enough people come around. It's a means of sacrificing the people who have the least defense, the people who are the most out of society. And I can't think of any good reason why practical self-defense, including violence, should not be turned to preserve lives.
Well, basically kind of encompassing these 2 comments, it would be helpful, and you both have kind of touched on this, difference between what is defense, and for the specific things, the manifestations of the right wing, and it comes in many ways, but do you proactively attack a right wing rally or meeting, or do you just, with arms if necessary, defend your events and your rallies and your communities from any attacks? And I think the specifics are helpful because we can, and I'm not saying you're all being rhetorical, but you can talk about violence, nonviolence, but in the events that we see in the news, in our communities, how do you specifically address those? And it's just important, I mean.
Yeah, since, so these 2 are similar points. What does self-defense mean when we are talking about a known entity? When we have libraries full of books to show us what fascism, what white supremacist organizing results in. When we have so many deaths that we don't even have, they're not even all counted. What does self-defense mean when we know that fascist organizing and white supremacist organizing is necessarily always violent and aggressive? What does self-defense mean? Self-defense not exclusively in a procedural, technical sense, whereby self-defense is only defined as when you perceive an imminent physical threat at the moment, but self-defense so that you prevent lives from being lost, you prevent bodily harm from happening, and you prevent movements from going large enough to even have this conversation. To me, no platform for fascism means no platform for fascism. It means do whatever you need to do, not anything, but whatever you need to do to stop a platform from emerging. For me, the militant, and I agree with the militant anti-fascist argument that preemptive self-defense, which some people think is a misnomer, preemptive self-defense, sometimes having in the toolbox, physically shutting down a Klan rally or a white supremacist event, is movement self-defense, it's community self-defense. It is not giving fascism and white supremacy the benefit of the doubt that it could ever exist in any form other than it being aggressively violent. So sometimes, yeah, it means attacking Klan rallies and white supremacist events and making sure that under no circumstances they will be allowed to function. Now, there's plenty of other ways to stop these events, and sometimes other ways work. But again, it's about having a range of options and a larger toolbox. Now, the retort to that, of course, and I'm going to try to not be too long-winded, so nudge me if you feel like I am. The retort to that is that that turns off potential sympathizers. But again, I would say, number one, having it out of the toolbox is dangerous, and two, actually, although Americans know much more about militant anti-fascism today than they probably ever have, tens of thousands of people show up to counter-protest in Boston and Berkeley and elsewhere. There are plenty of people who don't like militant anti-fascism but still show up to protest. So I don't think that these things coexisting are necessarily a problem, and there's plenty of examples in the US, Europe, and beyond of these various tendencies coexisting, forming movements, and essentially allocating different tasks. So that, to clarify, that is my interpretation of the militant anti-fascist position, one which I agree with. Yes, anti-fascist organizing has had some really important successes recently in preventing these groups from mobilizing. Fascists having a street presence is a really big deal in their ability to organize a movement. If you speak to experienced anti-fascists anywhere in the world, 101 is you don't let the fascists have the street. You never, ever, ever let the fascists have the street. You don't let the fascists have the street. You do what you need to do to stop the fascists from having the street. And also, even in terms of figures, Richard Spencer, Milo Yiannopoulos, these figures can't organize events anymore. They're going bankrupt. They've been discredited. Part of this has to do with doxing. I mean, doxing is a really big deal. George, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on doxing. Doxing is, at least in the sense that we think of violence and non-violent action, that has been really successful in discouraging a lot of these white supremacists from showing their face. And George, you were discussing the situation in Philly where a lot of people showed up and there were no, or very few fascists. If our worst problem is the fascists don't show up, then that doesn't sound like a problem to me at all. And anti-fascist demonstrations aren't just about stopping the fascists, they're also about promoting a kind of anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-transphobic movement that is arguably more important in and of itself than actually the response to some of these more marginal groups. I think that covers all the points.
Great. Okay. Where to start? So much. So, a place where you and I agree, in your book, I was delighted to see that you're very open to creative tactics. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. And the more creativity, the better, right? And there's that town recently that I heard somebody told me about in Germany, where there was an agreement that people would contribute money for every fascist who showed up, and so it became a big fundraiser, and it's of course a deterrent for a large number of fascists to show up because they're actually building the funding for the progressives, and that's the last thing they want to do. So that kind of hijinks, getting playful, again, the fear thing I think makes it hard for us to be playful and to be creative, because creativity is linked to playfulness rather than to fear. But let's highlight the times when people break out of a kind of defensive reaction. and move into creativity as a way of meeting people in the street. Yeah. What's the other thing that I wanted to respond to? Oh, your summing up of multiple antis. I mean, I do think that our political moment is suffering from a lack of vision, a 20-year or more vision aversion on the part of political discourse in our country. In the 70s, our country was very rich in envisioning the kind of society we wanted, but then we backslid with Ronald Reagan's presidency and got into a mode. Almost all the popular movements, except my movement, the LGBT movement, went into a kind of defensive mode. Let's defend previously held gains instead of let's keep advancing. That's what we had been doing in the 60s and 70s. With Ronald Reagan, it was more, oh, how can we hold on to what we've achieved, right? So that kind of defensive mode, which, by the way, meant that all the big movements that took up the defense all lost ground, right? Women are struggling for reproductive rights now, to retain them. The voting rights issue for civil rights, I mean, the labor movement has lost enormously. Every movement that's gone on the defensive has been losing like crazy since 1980. But LGBT people did not go on the defensive. We went on the offensive. And we kept winning all through that time. So, but one reason for the difference, I think, is that people had a vision of what we wanted, and we were willing to keep setting new goals toward the eventual equality that we believe we deserve. And that's why we kept moving forward. So that's one reason why, Mark, in your book you talk about anti-fascism as a kind of political identity, and you could see why that was really helpful for me to understand it in that way. And my identity is much more a kind of liberatory. Let's go for liberation, which means setting up goals and going ahead and achieving them and staying on the offensive, which it will enable us to win. So that's my thought about that.
All right, we're going to take a couple more questions here. Got you. I see you. Let's do these three up here, and then we'll come. Yeah, and then we'll come over here for the next one. Yeah.
So my question was for Mark. The way you framed it is that there's a militant anti-fascist movement that started after World War II. So where does like Clara Zetkin and the United Front register at all within that? Because that's well before this current period. So is there a difference between what you highlight as militant anti-fascism and the United Front? And I want to be very clear, that does not mean Popular Front, which is... I know the difference. Okay, I just want to... Well, other people may not. I don't mean trying to organize with capitalists against fascists, which is the Popular
Front. I can see your point with not giving fascists a platform, but I feel a little bit concerned about who is called a fascist sometimes. And for example, feminists who are critical of prostitution are sometimes no platform. They are not fascist, they are not violent, but it's a way of shutting down debate. And so I have some concerns about that.
And mine actually is kind of connected to what you just mentioned. I wanted to take a slightly different tack today and just say that when I was online with conservatives during the Kavanaugh hearings, I was being called a snowflake, I was being called a libtard, I was being called all these names, and I kept saying, I'm not these names, I'm not a snowflake, I'm not a libtard, I'm a human being, and I think we all are human beings. And I want to raise the question of how everybody creates rhetoric, and how they create language, and how they create description, kind of in a way which she's saying they're feminazi, trying to do that to prostitutes. But it's what are we doing at the fundamental level of thinking to make somebody the other, or even make that quality in ourselves the other, because I think it starts there. As soon as they can call you something other than human, they want to destroy you. But I'm saying we're all human, and what happened to that? Okay.
So just the historical question. So there was militant anti-fascism in the sense of being militant since there's been fascism, right? So in that sense, sure. What I meant by the specifically militant anti-fascist tradition was that tradition which described itself as such, and the point at which there was a sharp divide within the European left about whether to pursue governmental methods to shut down the far right, which many socialist and communist parties advocated after 45 in continental Europe, or not to. And so you're right. The militancy of anti-fascism goes back. It includes the United Front. It includes Clara Zetkin and other examples. I'm talking about a term used to demarcate one specific orientation in a post-war anti-fascist debate and the legacy of those groups that move forward. And there's a lot of differences between what it means to be an anti-fascist in the 1990s versus the 1920s. I'm just sort of referencing those things, but point taken. Who is a fascist? I think you'll find that if you read the writings of anti-fascist organizations, if you speak to people who are organizing against fascism, they have a pretty good understanding of what they're doing. I do think that fascism is a bit of a nebulous political concept, in part because fascists abandon and discard ideas all the time. They don't really give a shit about rationality or ideological consistency. That having been said, though, there's debate in the historical world about whether you should define fascism in terms of lists. Without getting too far into that historiographical question, we can at least throw out some basic tenets around ultranationalism, misogyny, violence, organization of a mass party, or attempt to mass politics in the interest of essentially returning natural hierarchies, et cetera, et cetera. There's plenty to be said along those lines. Now, shutting down someone you disagree with is as old as there have been people to disagree with. Back in the 19th century, in many societies, political meetings were broken up all the time by everyone because, now you can like that or dislike that, but I don't think that there's anything particularly unique to the question of anti-fascism over the notion of who ought to be tolerated in society, who ought to be accepted, who ought to be given a platform, what to do. I disagree with sex worker exclusionary radical feminism. I'm going to leave it up to sex workers and their allies to decide how to wage that struggle. As far as the question of making the other, there's a whole philosophical discussion to be had about that, but certainly those who are on the receiving end of the violence of white supremacy and fascism have been made the other. They have no choice but to be the other, right? They have been made it, it's been beaten into their bodies, it's been written into laws. It is an established fact. The question is, what do you do about that? And to deny that differentiation is not productive. You have to acknowledge it, work through it. Yes, it'd be great if someday if we could all just see each other as people, but the fact that so many people don't means we need to organize in response to that.
Okay, let's take some questions from this side of the room. I got 1, 2 in the blue, and 3.5.
I'm sympathetic, Mark, with your thoughts about having this reverse, that just literally self-defense is not enough, but it has to be proactive. The concern I have actually is, especially in the time with the current movements, is what does that really look like? Like, if there was a Nazi march, do we think it's okay to drive through it? In Charlottesville and kill some people. Is it okay to shoot Tommy Robinson or Richard Spencer? Like, we might say, oh no, because, in other words, where's the line? Like, I feel like even in the Bay Area, like, at various demonstrations, like, is it okay? Maybe it's against the police and not the Klan. Is it enough to have a militant demonstration? Do we also have to break windows at Starbucks or beat up some poor guy on the corner, right? Like, it's not clear to me that there's a level of rigor and discipline. Like, first of all, there's the question of killing, and then there's the question of rigor and discipline among people who believe in these politics about, self-defense writ large. And I have some doubts about their ability to make those distinctions, at least in this time.
Mark mentioned that a variety of strategies is
respond to that. It seems to me that there are certainly some procedural difficulties in certain situations in doing that. And people does attract a certain amount of, well, it spreads a certain amount of resistance for middle class people to participate. So those are some of the things.
George, I was really happy that you started this by drawing on personal experience and struggle to make your arguments, particularly when talking about civil rights movement and the Southern strategy, the experience of SNCC. And I think that it's important for us to be able to draw on experience in terms of movement learning, collective learning, and development. At the same time, it's also pretty clear to most of us, I think, that the civil rights movement, more than any movement, is so heavily mythologized. And I'm wondering if the claims that you make don't succumb to that when they're taken alongside the position put forward by people like Charles Cobb, who was a field organizer with SNCC, in his book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, where he talks about the active and important role that armed self-defense played in the Southern strategy. Thank you.
What if I respond to that? That's so great, because you're so direct. Yeah, so I was pulled into the training program for Mississippi Summer 1964. Remember, I mentioned 1963. The SNCC workers went in, and Bob Moses, who was the head of that project, said, "Let's invite 1,000 young people from the North to come down to Mississippi and do voter registration in freedom schools in the summer of '64." And his interest in doing that was to actually increase the protection for the marginalized, right? Because he figured it would be mostly northern white people, but also some northern African American people whose families would be all over their Congress people and so on if their children were down in Mississippi, right? And so it would bring a kind of protection to the SNCC project in Mississippi if that happened. So, but then they needed to be trained. So I was pulled into the training corps, and we did that training in Ohio. So we did it in 2 weeks because we thought 2 batches would be better. First batch, 450, 500 people. Did that training. They got on buses. They went off to Mississippi. Second day of the second week, we're called into the auditorium. Somebody looking very somber steps forward on the platform and says, "I have very bad news. 3 of our summer workers are missing, and we believe dead." And actually, one of them was a field worker already down there, and then 2 others who had been in the previous week's training. So I'm a sociologist. I'm interested in observing people. So I was sitting on one side and watching the reaction of these 450 or so young people, and I thought, most of them will be out of here tomorrow. Their parents, for one thing, will be calling them up and saying, "Come home." And people who were sitting in their seats last week are now dead. So we did the most intense, you can imagine, work the rest of the week with those young people. The SNCC workers who were on the campus were big brothers, big sisters, helping the young people to get courageous enough to be able to go to Mississippi, and almost all of them went to Mississippi. Okay, so during that time, though, I got a chance to talk to Bob Moses because he was this mathematical guy. I mean, he thinks strategically because I think he's a mathematics guy. I take that all back. All of us can think strategically. Anyway, but he was extraordinary. And I wanted to know why SNCC workers hadn't, since they'd entered in '63, he'd gone with others, why hadn't they been wiped out? He said, "We haven't been wiped out because we don't have guns in our freedom houses, and everyone knows it." And I said, "I'm sorry, but I don't get it. I don't get the mechanism. How does that protect you?" And he said, "Okay, picture this. Worker comes into the hardware store back to work, tells his boss in the morning, I'm really, really excited because tonight we're going to get him. That freedom house of, blah, blah, on the outskirts of town, we're going to get him tonight." And he's all excited. Right? The boss, the hardware store boss, says, "No, you're not. I'm not going to put up with that." Now the worker, the boss knows the worker is a member of the Ku Klux Klan. But the worker knows that the boss is a member of the White Citizens Council, just as eager to maintain segregation as the Klan is, but middle-class people who are concerned about that. So the worker doesn't understand what he's saying. Why are you telling me that we shouldn't do that? I don't understand. And the employer says it's because we, in Mississippi, we're kind of a hellhole in terms of getting capital from the north to be able to do our economic development that's badly needed here. And all we need is a bunch of people out there shooting up a bunch of folks, and we can forget about that. In other words, we will get an economic, it's in line with what you were saying earlier, we'll get an economic pushback from the north because of your stupid action, so I won't let you do it. So I look at Bob and I say, so you're using one set of bad guys to control another set of bad guys to keep you safe. And he said, right, and it would never work if we had guns in our freedom houses. Because then they would just come out, they would say, oh, there's a shootout, we were defending ourselves, and guess who gets to paint that picture? It's the oppressors who get to paint that picture, right? And so our lovely white people are being, shot by these terrible black people in the Freedom House, and so on and so on. And it's all over. It's all over for the movement if that happens. So in other words, they were doing what frequently happens in very heated nonviolent struggles, which is that they were using their own vulnerability to keep them safe. And it worked. And it was almost 1,000 northern young people who went down and aided them by being vulnerable in those situations in order to keep them safe enough, in order to turn Mississippi around and legalize segregation there. It's an extraordinary story, and we need to understand that this idea that violence equals protection is actually a mistaken idea.
All right, so we just have a couple minutes left. We're going to let Mark respond.
Yeah, the question's directed towards me. So politics are messy, politics are difficult. If politics were like math, we could come up with the right answer. All politics are messy. It's especially messy when you get into politics that involves conflict and violence. There is no equation that I can give to anyone about when it's right to use certain kinds of force. And for law enforcement in the room, because we all know there is law enforcement in the room, I'm not calling for the killing of anyone under any circumstances. I think that what force is appropriate in the anti-fascist struggle is contextual. It's up to the groups involved in the struggle to determine what makes sense in their context. But anti-fascists do engage in the kinds of discussion and debate and calculation that you ask whether they do. One example, I spoke with some of the Seven Hills Antifa from Virginia who helped organize the counter-protest in Charlottesville. And they had meetings in coalition with anarchist people of color, Black Lives Matter, Surge, campus environmental organizations from UVA, and they discussed and came up with sort of community agreements about a variety of things. One was, do we bring firearms to the demonstration? It was decided no, among those groups not to do that. Do we organize a black bloc? It was decided no, among those groups not to do that. And the irony of it is that according to these anti-fascists I spoke to, those who were most in favor of organizing the black bloc in that specific conversation were the white surge organizers who argued that it is the duty of white people to put their bodies on the line. The anti-fascists actually disagreed in part because there's an anti-masking law, in part because the fascists had called out the black bloc and they didn't want to play into that dynamic. So that's one example, but it's not, I would say, rare that groups who organize protests, a variety of backgrounds, come up to sort of community agreements about what to do. That doesn't, of course, erase the difficult questions of politics, but it is one example. As far as it turning off middle-class people, the first question is, what does it do for people who are most threatened by these politics? That always needs to be the starting point of reference when we discuss organizing against fascism, really with anything, right? Is who's most affected, and working from there. That's not to say that you don't try to make arguments to bring in allies or try to build coalitions, But I think the notion that politics always succeed based on whether they can get like more than 50% public approval is not borne out by any evidence. And I want to just wrap up my comment.
I agree with that.
Yeah, I just want to wrap up my comment with an anecdote that I was told by an anti-fascist in Madrid. He said, he's a union organizer and an anti-fascist, and he said, oftentimes when I put on my mask to fight the fascists, a lot of people don't like me and think I'm a villain. When I take my mask off, my community loves me and I organize and we build for workers' power. His argument was not all politics need to be put in the same box. And if there's a situation where a lot of people don't like anti-fascists, but they succeed in shutting down a far-right movement, that's not necessarily the worst scenario in the world.
Let's bring everybody in. And thank you all for being here and being part of principled debate, which we need more on the left to strengthen our fight against fascism. Thank you.